Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled The Art and Science of a Successful Staffing Sales Professional. My name's Eric Gregg. We'll give people a few minutes to get into seats here. We're expecting a pretty good crowd for today's conversation. So while we're doing that, I'm just going to give you a little bit of housekeeping. This is meant to be a conversation. I'll introduce Adrian and Mike here in a minute, but they're two of the brightest guys and have access to some of the best data in the industry. And so I want to make sure that we are getting to the types of things that you want to have answered. So if you have questions, please put them into the chat, or you could put them into the Q&A tab, and we will get to each of those questions as we get through the sections as well. The other thing is that we are recording this, and while most of the value's in the conversation, there's definitely some pretty good slides here that you may want to refer back to. So we'll get the recording and the slides out to you probably by Thursday this week. And so you should have access to that as well. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and jump in and get started. I want to introduce myself. My name's Eric Gregg. I'm the founder of ClearlyRated, and one of, ClearlyRated is probably the leading provider of client experience and buyer data for the staffing industry. And I'm joined today by Adrian and Mike, and I'm going to introduce Mike first. Mike Perrone is the COO at Prodoscore, which is a leading provider of employee engagement insights for professional service firms. He's got 20 plus years experience, including multiple roles, leading sales, revenue generation for a variety of high growth companies. Mike, welcome. And I just want to start with asking you, you get to look at this data for a lot of different companies, and you get to talk to a lot of leaders about what's kind of holding them back. What do you see as kind of one of the biggest barriers to growth for staffing firms that you engage with?
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Eric. Really excited to be here today. Yeah, I think when let's say a prospect jumps on a call with us, right? And usually we're talking with, chief revenue officers, chief operating officers. And I'd say the biggest challenge they see from a growth perspective is kind of visibility into the data. They usually start the conversation, Eric, of we need visibility, right? And then it's like, I got to go a couple layers deeper on that. And then it becomes, once you get to that layer, it's okay, how can my leaders digest the data, right? And make it actionable. Then it becomes, okay, how do I take my, my A players and understand what they do so I can replicate that performance for growth, right? So it really always starts at the visibility level, and then it kind of from there goes into these other key components that what do I do with the data? How do I digest it and plan for effective growth?
Yeah. What's the information that I'm missing? And then once I have that information, how do I actually make sense of it, right? So that I can take action on it and, improve, not just measure.
Yeah, and I think we see a lot of organizations kind of manage, looking at the data from a top-down perspective, right? Like executives in a Microsoft BI platform or Snowflake or, big data, Tableau type thing, and they're looking at the data, right? But feeding that to the frontline managers, even the employees, right? Even the sales employees on how they can improve from a visibility perspective.
Yeah, and we'll dive into that a little bit deeper. I want to bring in Adrian here as well. Next up is Adrian Reece. He's a seasoned data scientist, a specialist in the field of people analytics. When he isn't working on his PhD from Claremont Graduate University, he's the head of data science at Prodoscore. When I first talked to Adrian, I was impressed mostly by my inability to keep up with what his analytics team was doing. And it was from that, as he slowed it down so that I could actually understand, all the impact, that I started to see just how important some of this information is, and why, really what was born out of this conversation that we're having today. Adrian, same question to you. From your standpoint, what do you see in the data? What kind of holds staffing firm growth back in your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Eric, again for the warm introduction. What I tend to see as a barrier to growth is really leadership. So people don't tend to leave bad organizations, they tend to leave bad leaders. And those leaders being able to cater to the needs of their people. Specifically, we live in a world that is more in line with hybrid than people coming into the office all the time. And how exactly do you manage these people? How do you ensure that you're connected to the people on your team so that you're still maintaining the same type of output that you were when everyone was in the office? I think is one of the biggest barriers. So it builds off of Mike's visibility, but it's really the leaders being able to get the information that they need at the time, to actually intervene with the
Yeah,
people.
it's really interesting because obviously I'm clearly rated is likes to geek out on measurement as well, and I think what happens, one of the reasons why measuring is so important on some of these things is that we convince ourselves that we're doing things maybe that we're actually not doing, right? And then organizationally that flows out from there, right? So we might think that we're being really productive, but then when we start to look into the data, we realize, oh, you know what? I'm killing a lot of time, right? I took Facebook off my phone. If you would have asked me if I spend any time on Facebook, I would have said absolutely no, not at all. But then when you look at the time on phone, my time on phone went down by like 15 minutes a day that I was just blowing and wasting, looking at what friends, from 35 years ago were doing with their kids at soccer, right? And so it's you really have to measure that stuff to be able to kind of see some of that go through there. And I want to take a second here. So we're doing a little bit of a slide and a poll here. And so what I want you to do is rank the biggest barriers to revenue growth at your firm. And all you have to do is take a QR grab on it, and it should bring up this slide deal. And so you can put that into the space here. And I would actually encourage Adrian and Mike, you guys to take it as well. For your firm, what are the top three that are spending those issues there as well? So we're seeing some of this come in. I'll let that poll stay active just a little bit longer while you all are filling it out here. But the options are not enough expansion of our existing customers, not enough time spent on business development, difficult macroeconomic conditions, too much turnover, and not enough leads on new accounts. Perfect. Seeing some of the data come in here. So it looks like the first piece of it is, look, we're just not spending the time on it. And the second highest ranked piece is the expansion. What's interesting is that we actually put the macroeconomic conditions in the markets down at number 4. So what this is telling me is that, look, we've got a pretty good consensus that the market conditions themselves are not what's holding us back. There's other things within our capabilities that we can look at. So what we're going to be looking at here is, what do buyers really want in a sales process? What do top sales reps do differently? And how do we engage these top performers to avoid costly churn that, we estimate is, anytime you lose a top performing sales rep, you're looking at somewhere between 150 and $300,000 in lost growth, just in the amount of time to get somebody back up to speed, assuming that you get somebody as good as a part of that. So we want to make sure that we spend a little bit of time on the connection here between the employee engagement and that growth as well. So let's jump into what buyers really want. Well, you all said that it's lower on your list of things that are holding you back. But it is important for us to recognize that we are in a era of unprecedented, either real or perceived, right? It doesn't really matter in terms of whether this is real uncertainty or perceived uncertainty, because perception is reality when it comes to how businesses react in times of economic uncertainty. And this is looking at Stanford and Northwestern's view of this. And they track about 2,000 different newspapers and news sources, and they track the incidence of things like economic and uncertainty and things that are sort of generally terms that are generally associated with that. And they've indexed that back actually all the way back to 1984. But you can see here over the course of the last few years, we peaked a lot during pandemic. And then, we came back down. But when you look at the 6 months, of COVID, we're at about 2.2 times higher than that, 3.1 times higher than 100 days ago. So we are really in a cycle where there's a lot of discussion about what's coming ahead and a lot of uncertainty there. But let's get to the things that we can control, because I agree there's a lot more in our control that's holding us back from growth than out of our control. And so we asked, hiring managers and buyers of staffing services, what are the most influential factors during the sales process? And you can see that, the top of the list was the industry specialization. Reputation is also really impactful there. And then the strong firm performance metrics. And this kind of falls into a trend that we've been talking a lot about, which is, look, people need to de-risk that decision to utilize you. And part of how they do that is if you know a lot about their industry, it helps to, take some of that risk away. If you can show them, strong testimonials, if you could prove that reputation that others have had a great experience with you, that all impacts their ability to do this and with confidence. And so, the firms that we're seeing grow right now are really the specialists, right? And they're going beyond this bottom level, which is where a lot of staffing firms spend most of their time from a marketing and a sales standpoint, is trying to convince people that, hey, we are really good at hiring and we know what we need to know about hiring. We can help you because we know so much about hiring. But what I would encourage you is to go to this next level, which the data really shows is important to buyers, which is, okay, yes, you can hire. I've checked that box. I believe you when you say and you show me how you're an expert at that. But show me that you have domain expertise in my industry. Show me that you can work with companies like mine. And then last but not least, okay, once I believe that you're really good at what you do and you actually have knowledge of my unique types of hiring or my industry or my company size, now I want to see the evidence of that delivery, right? And making sure that that comes through. So make sure that you're spending time in both your marketing and your sales enablement on those second two levels as well, because that's a huge advantage for the firms that are incumbent, right? You have the ability to expand far more than a new outside firm. Additionally, we want to understand, like, what do buyers actually think, right? And right now, they believe that if they hire through staffing firms, they're going to get additional expertise, compliance, speed up the hiring process. But they also, a significant percentage, believe it's too expensive, doesn't have as much flexibility as some other types of talent solutions, misnomers about the type of talent that we're able to provide. And so, the reason I bring this up is, any good sales process is going to understand and lean in on the positives here and have really specific objection handling conversations about this concept, right? We have to prove to them that it's not too expensive, that we can meet the flexibility needs that they have. And those items are really, really important there as well. So the last piece on this is, look, buyers want a sales process that adds value to them. If they're meeting with you and let's say two other staffing firms about some potential orders that they have coming up, at a minimum, that is going to be, a third of their day that they give, and they deserve something back on that. And so I think when I look at this, the successful salespeople that I see, they're coming through and they're adding value, whether they get hired or not, right? They're displaying how they can add value instead of just telling how they will be able to add value in the future. And I think we need to ask this question, right? What did I share that they might actually share with others? What did I do to actually create a situation where they're better off than had they not talked to me? And those are key things that we really want to kind of have come through here. So we're at the end of the first session, which is, a chance to kind of bring in Mike and Adrian and kind of get their thoughts on this. It's also a chance for you all to ask questions of me, Mike, Adrian. So if you have questions, again, put them into the Q&A tab or the chat. I am monitoring both of those as well. So, let's start, Mike, with you. We'll be getting into the employee data shortly. And what you found that drives differences between top performers and the rest. But in the section I shared with you, what stands out in terms of buyer behavior, any areas that you see, or maybe a disconnect with the data that you all track, or maybe reinforce the data that you track?
Yeah, I think, I think like what maybe gets overlooked there, but was very relevant in what you shared, I'd say it was around kind of the industry specific, the industry specialization, and around kind of the use cases. And where I see sales leaders struggle, and I've struggled with it over my days, is I think it's the holding the salespeople accountable for preparation and planning. And when I think of like industry specialization, it's all about like if you prepare for that meeting, you probably can find use cases, right? Marketing has usually got a lot of stuff for you to enable you. You have, and if you prepare to set yourself apart from an industry, perspective and with case studies on that conversation, that really drives it home. And that's kind of what you were showing there. I've always seen that the best salespeople properly plan prior to a meeting. So when they're on that sales opportunity, they're really maximizing that conversation to set themselves apart. And sometimes like the sales leaders let their sales professionals go through the motions versus that accountability that you can drive as a sales leader to your salespeople to make sure they take that extra 30, 45 minutes before that meeting to really maximize the value. So that's what kind of, I saw it all over your pyramids, but the industry specific to set yourself apart in those opportunities is really the planning and the preparation prior to that conversation.
Yeah, I remember taking a negotiation class, and I'm a pretty notoriously bad negotiator. But the one thing I do remember taking out from that really stuck with me was this advice to spend 3/4 of your time on what the other side wants and a quarter of the time on what you want. And I think the same holds true on the sales side, right? We tend to spend 75% of the time on what we want out of the call and what our product or service can do. And really what the buyer wants is like, show that you know me, right? And come in and let's have a conversation and then add some value there and open the door to the additional value that maybe your product or service can add.
100%. It allows them to, be prepared to pinpoint what's going to, help you win that opportunity.
Yeah. Adrian, you get to look at all sorts of data, to help us make sense of what it's actually telling us. What do you think is so difficult for us to change our thinking based on new data and situations? Because I do feel like some of this data that we've shown for years in staffing, we haven't really seen that buyer experience change as dramatically. What holds people back from making those difficult changes?
Yeah, I see it. I see two sides to this. It's really psychological inertia and interpretation in my mind. Confirmation biasing is real. We tend to seek out information that already aligns with our pre-existing beliefs. Another concept that comes to mind is anchoring. The very first piece of information or the very initial interpretation is going to shape how we see all information afterwards, since it sets our expectations. And those expectations are very difficult, specifically for sales leaders to break. So for instance, we have leaders in which think that their employees are more productive when they're in the office, but we have data that clearly shows that there are certain roles that are more productive when they are remote. And it's more of a function of their job, and really being able to convince them with data and show them that the data is showing that there is a bit of heterogeneity going on there. I find is a little difficult for some leaders to swallow, specifically saying, hey, this person's more productive remote. In addition, it's just there's a lot of data out there. Data itself really dictates how it should be handled. It's more of the interpretation element that I think customers run into issues with. So that's a lot of what our team focuses on. We really work with the customer, figure out where their pain points are as a business and help them with that data interpretation piece. And it's been quite transformative for quite a few of our customers.
Yeah, the ability to dive a step deeper into data is oftentimes really critical as there as well. It doesn't look like we have any questions on this section from the audience, so I suspect we will on these other ones, because the next set of questions are really the area that I know people really are hungry for, which is what do these top sales reps do differently? We've got one more poll, and then Mike, I'll hand it over to you so that you and Adrian can walk through some of that information as well. So this should be pulling up on your Slido again. What's the number one attribute of a successful business developer? And you can go ahead and pick the top one there. Is it that they out hustle others? They diligently follow a business development framework. They build relationships for the long term. They're extremely efficient with their time, or they know the industries they serve better than others. So go ahead and put that in. We'll give people just a couple minutes to share their poll on that as well. I can already tell, Mike, Adrian, I can already tell that this is really leading you guys up to change some perspectives on this with what we see on the poll results. So about 50% said that they build relationships for the long term. I do think that that's really important. Following the business development framework, extremely efficient, knowing the industries all show up. But I mean, could I tee you up better? Nobody said that they out hustle others, but I think that you would potentially disagree with that. So I'll hand it over to you guys to share.
Yeah, absolutely. So Mike, if you don't mind, I'll take lead on this one. Ultimately, what I would say separate the top sales employee from those that are C players, A being our top players, C being our bottom players. It's just they show up differently. They really do show up differently. It's not necessarily that they're working more, they're working harder. It's just they're working a lot more efficiently with their time. And we tend to see it on our cloud tools. Their days are a lot more structured than those C players. We might see the similar amount of hours, but within those hours, there's definitely higher amounts of active time we're seeing in the A players.
Yeah, it's fascinating here as I work on different kind of use cases. You've got all, you've got these different productivity levels that we measure against, but there's also this component that comes down to how active are they throughout the day, and it's fascinating to see that component. They could be using a variety, like this active tool. We'll get into kind of like external activities, internal activities, but this is just all activities in general, and it's fascinating that it's a variety of CRM and phone calls and meetings and emails and chat, right? It's all of the different collaboration. But at the end of the day, we see when we look at the A players from a revenue attainment perspective, they are about 2 hours more productive than the C players that aren't attaining their quota, just from an active time perspective on all the various tools that they might be using throughout the day. So it is kind of fascinating there.
Cool.
Another data point we've got next to share. Let me see. Here we go.
Yeah. So building off of active time, we focus on external versus internal activities. And something else that we identified is specifically in the A players, they're spending a lot more time on external activities than what we're seeing in our C players. So that leans into building stronger long-term relationships. It's interesting that that was one of the top answers in the poll, because these external activities are how your sales leaders and sales reps go about building those relationships. So it's not surprising to see here. The internal activities, we tend to see about the same amount of activity in the A, B, and C players. But I'm going to pass it on to Mike to speak more about these internal and external activities.
Yeah, so like the last slide showed kind of just active time in general, like how active are they on these tools. Then you kind of take the next step, the next layer underneath, and you categorize them. And this is a lot of the firms, when they look at their account managers and business development and senior sales folks, they want to understand the layer, that next layer, which is okay, the external activities, right? And when you're thinking of a salesperson, these are going to be all of the prospecting, right? The cold prospecting, as well as all of the outreach to their current customers, right? So in that poll example, right, they're very active with their base and building relationships. So it's not like just a new business development person, cranking on the phone, but they do a lot of activities to keep their base and build the relationship. So when you think of these external activities, you've got the calls, the SMS, calendar, video meetings, all of that rich data that is kind of that prospecting relationship, building efforts. And then you've got the internal activities component, right? Which is, updating the CRM, right? Utilizing your different sales tools like a Zoom Info and those type of products. Your Office suite of, as well as, like email, internal collaboration, right? All of those components kind of pull into the internal activities. And it's fascinating when Adrian does these studies with clients where you get the A players, the B players, and the C players. You look at this component, and it's always the ones that drive the higher external activities are going to be the top producers. So it's just kind of fascinating when you take that next layer down to look at the type of activity, it correlates to the external activity component. And what's fascinating about this too is the internal activities. It's not that the A players don't use the CRM and don't use those different applications. They use it almost identical to the A, B, and C players. It's, so it's the internal component is pretty steady across the board. You just see that drive in external, activities that leads to the A players. Next data point we've got here, I'll let you kind of dive into it, Adrian, is around the leaders of the salespeople.
Yeah, absolutely. So these collaboration statistics are very close to my heart. A lot of my research focuses on leadership as a whole, and nothing frustrates me more than a leader who wants to act like an individual contributor. If you're going to be a leader, if you're going to be a manager, act like a manager, facilitate good work. And what we tend to see when customers are giving us their outcomes is that those managers and those leaders that have higher performing teams, as a leader, they're collaborating significantly more. They're collaborating with about 2.4 times as many people inside their organization than those leaders of teams that are underperforming. And not to mention, despite only reaching out to 2.4 times more people, their collaboration is about 3.5 times higher. That means not only are they reaching out to more people, but the richness of that collaboration, the frequency is significantly higher, and we see it in the teams. So it's really that leader being able to facilitate good work and, I believe, connect people with the actual resources and others in their organization that provide the greatest amount of value to them, or help them actually close deals, for instance, integrating and working, let's just say, with the development team, for our case, are those leaders and teams that succeed the most.
Yeah, this one was eye-opening for that kind of Adrian brought to me and the team at Prodoscore as we started to look at collaboration. And so like in these studies we've done, we've gotten the leaders that, met and exceeded quota, right? These are these A players. And what's fascinating is those slides I showed you earlier are a lot driven around activity, right? And how active they are. And what was interesting about this study is the A players and the C players, even though one met and exceeded quota and the other one was lower on the revenue perspective from a leadership side, was their activity from all the tool usage was about identical from a productivity scoring perspective. You just saw an innate difference in how they collaborate. So really it's different, right? Like if you're the sales rep, we're noticing the harder you work, the more activity you drive, especially from an external perspective. We see that in the results where there's not as much correlation with the sales leader. It's actually driven around how are they collaborating with the people underneath them.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've got one more data point to share here. Oh, sorry, Eric, I kind of go
No,
back.
that's all right. We got the
Yeah.
one more
One more poll question here.
one more poll.
This one's always a good one. In your opinion, where do you think people are most productive?
I think I gave this one away.
We'll see. It's operating a little bit as a quiz here, but I actually think the underlying, having read one chapter ahead in the book, than our audience here, I think the underlying component of this, to me, was kind of fascinating on this. So it'll be interesting. We'll give people just a second or two to finish these up, and then we can kind of move forward here.
All right, looks like we got some hybrid and working in office.
Yeah.
Let me know when you want me to go
Yeah,
on it.
let's go ahead and move
Okay.
on to the
Yeah, we'll show what the data
yeah,
shows.
depends on
Depends on the person. Oh, there we go. All right.
There it is.
All right, Adrian, I'll let you walk through this.
Yeah. All right. So I will say 100% it depends on the person. So what we tend to see, what's really interesting is when we run these outcome studies with our customers, for the most part, when we're looking at the A players, we tend to see the same amount of general activity and productivity when people are in the office versus when they're at home. They are utilizing tools a bit differently, but you don't necessarily see that in their productivity score. But for those that are C players, it's a completely different story. I'm interested to run this study across even more customers because there are certain individuals that literally fall off a cliff. What you'll see is when they're in the office, there's a plethora of activity, but then when they're remote, all you see them do is just join meetings and their schedule is filled. You don't see the same amount of activity at all. And it shows up in our score. Specifically for this example, in our C players, we saw about 10 points, productivity points lower when the C players were at home versus when they were in the office. This is a very interesting one. Specifically, are people more productive when they're in the office when they're hybrid, when they're remote, 100% the individual. But to be honest with you, what we tend to see in the data is those that are in office and those that follow a 3-2 work schedule, we tend to see no significant difference in their general productivity scores in those two types of work settings. So 100% depends on the person. But if you needed to choose a work setting, I would say a 3-2 hybrid definitely won't do you bad.
Yeah, this is an interesting one when we talk to kind of our clients, because we hear, you know, a lot of the leaders that I get on there, everyone back to the office. You know, you get that from like the CEO level, Eric, you know, they're everyone back to the office. And you know, you've got the employees like, you know, I'm working effective in both areas, right? But you know, and so when you get a solution like that, like you want to provide them the flexibility for the employees so you can retain these good employees, but like at the end, at the highest level, you want some type of accountability, right? And there's kind of a mix between those two, and it really does help to kind of, if you're managing a team that's hybrid, it really is the person, right? And be able to manage to that effectively, right? Where if you see a scenario where they drop so much when they're remote, being able to at least understand that, have some comprehension behind that data, and be able to kind of coach accordingly to that, right? There's so many use cases I've heard from, you know, people with this data, be able to, you know, conducively give them a more flexible schedule because they see that type of performance versus, you know, some people like, hey, your remote work is not conducive to the activity levels that you need to be driving to be successful. So let's, you know, kind of pivot and come back to the office, and they're better for it, right? You know, they're hitting their results, they're performing, you know, and it's at least based on data versus kind of gut feel, which is what we get a lot of.
Yeah.
Based, you know, I guess, Eric, you know, I kind of just shared all that data with you. You know, you asked me kind of what jumped out at, you know, for me, what kind of jumps out at you from what we shared that kind of, you think is kind of relevant or have questions behind.
Yeah, I'll give you my answer to that, and then I'll also say that the Q&A panel is actually lit up. So that's a good sign. That means that there's a lot of engagement on this topic from the audience here. So I'll make sure and get to some of those questions while they're fresh for us as well. I think that the thing that stands out to me is, and it's sort of a maddening piece of it, right? Because when we look at it, what we want to be able to say is like, okay, I can, you know, show you 10 potential sales reps that you might hire, and I can tell you the 4 that are going to succeed because they have X, Y, and Z. And it's similar to what we see in a lot. You know, everybody asks us like, what do the firms that deliver, you know, better client experience, like, and the reps that deliver higher, you know, client experience scores, what do they do differently? And maddeningly, they just care more, right? And I think we see this in this. They just hustle more, they try more. And it's not necessarily that they are more skilled, it's that they are spending the time on that piece. I guess one question that I had, and then we'll go to the questions in the group, is when you look at this, is it fair to say that one of the big things that we ought to be thinking about to have an entire sales organization become more successful is making it as efficient as possible to do those internal tasks? Because that is kind of a universal, it's almost like, yeah, look, everybody's got to do that. And then you get that stuff done, and that creates the opportunity to go do these really high value external tasks. Is that kind of how you read that? Is look, you got to do a certain amount of the internal stuff. So make that as efficient as possible for people, and then encourage them to spend time externally as well.
Yeah, and I think it's, you know, we as sales leaders, we manage so much to kind of that end result,
Yeah.
right? We kind of manage to, did you hit your quota? Did you get your gross profit? Did you, you know what I mean? Did you hit those metrics? And I think what's helpful when you start thinking about like the internal, the external, the amount of activity, is think of those as like leading indicators into that end outcome, right? And it allows you to kind of be able to create a path, because you know, having the visibility into those leading indicators allows you to kind of see those gaps quicker where, holy cow, they're spending way too much time on internal and external, or they're doing a lot of external, well, maybe not doing it the right way, right? Or you know, so it really, like, by focusing on that kind of leading indicator into like the internal and external activities, is it really allows you to kind of see the skill versus will component as a sales leader. And that's one of the hardest things that I've ever had to kind of try to figure out. It was a lot easier when we were all in the office together. You can kind of see it those, but it's been always very difficult of like, gosh, that guy should be the best salesperson ever. Why are they not hitting their end result? Well, in that scenario, maybe he didn't have the will for it. And it takes a lot of will to do the external activities. That's the prospecting, the fear of rejection, the building the pipeline. And so it really helps you digest that will versus skill very quickly, and then be able to diagnose the kind of the leading indicators and the activities to properly set them up to hit the end results.
Yeah, yeah, that makes perfect sense as well. Adrian, I want to ask you this question. There's some real differences between A, B, and C players, and sometimes they're subtle, and then sometimes they're huge. And you talked about the collaboration piece of this. Like, can you talk a little bit about what type of collaboration that is typically that you see that kind of leads to that, and why do you think that's really so important?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are three main modalities that we measure collaboration. It's based on how people are chatting and messaging one another, how they're collaborating in meetings similar to what we're in now, voice and video, and also how are they emailing one another and how are emails being sent out. And specifically, that stat that I had with regards to the difference between the A and C players applies to leaders. For the actual sales reps, we tend to not see such a drastic difference between A and C players with regards to internal collaboration. Actually, tend to not see any difference. We actually probably tend to see a little less internal collaboration from your A players than what we're seeing from your C players. I think why it becomes so important really deals with the fact that the manager is more engaged. The manager's engaging with the team members, so that will and skill consideration that Mike just spoke to, I think becomes really important. The manager is able to tap in and really figure out, okay, is this person, let's just say if we look at the number of calls and the amount of time that people spend on those calls, we're able to see, okay, was this someone who called and there wasn't a response, or is it an actual connection that occurred? For a leader to then be able to see that data and coach their people on, hey, I see that you were sending or you were calling people in the afternoon, maybe try it before lunch, for instance.
Yeah.
Those types of coaching techniques, I think, allows the leader to increase the amount of skill in which the employee applies to work. And then you're also, from interacting with the employee, you can weed out those individuals that aren't necessarily showing the will. Those that are a bit more flippant towards what needs to be done at work, I think is really why we see these differences in the number.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. A follow-on question to that is in the Q&A tab is, do you find of those three different types of collaboration with your sales leaders, is there one that stands out more than the others? Is it that they're, really way more active on chat, or they're sending more emails, or they're doing more actual meetings?
Yeah, the one in which we see the biggest difference would definitely be chat. Keep in mind that a lot of our customers do work in that hybrid type of environment. So that's where we tend to see the leaders, where we see them in the A group where their teams are performing well. We tend to see higher chats over the other modalities. Email is a little tough. We're still analyzing that data because we look at not just who the email sent to, but who's CC'd and who's BCC'd on that email. So that data is a little inconclusive with regards to are we seeing that same disparity or that same difference in email activity, but voice and video, I would say, is about the same. So
Okay.
best way to answer is messaging is where you see the biggest difference.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily as a leader that you need to fill up your day with meetings. You just need to
No,
be present, right? It's almost the real time presence and engagement as opposed to the scheduled meetings.
100%.
Yeah, that's great. Another question for you, Adrian. How do you define A, B, and C players? Is A above quota or a certain percentage above quota?
Yeah, so we have a few different modalities that we utilize. So it depends on if the customer has their own outcome data to share with us.
Yeah.
So certain customers don't measure or they don't have the data readily available. So for those customers, we reach out to the managers of the teams and we have them decide who's the A, who's the B, and who's the C player on your team. But for some of the customers that do have outcome data, specifically goal attainment, then we're able to set them into different groups of those that did not meet quota, those who just met quota or a little behind, and those that are far exceeding quota. And we
Gotcha.
turn those into APC groups as well. We work with the customer to figure out where the best cutoff, the most meaningful cutoff is.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Because if you don't have any A players, traditionally A players, then you want to kind of shift that a little bit, or vice versa, right? You don't want to make it so that, you want to define it based on the individuals, but that's helpful for the data that we have here. Another question, and maybe Mike, you can hit this. With so many people trying to bring back to the office, Adrian talked about a 3-2 split. Are there any particular days that are better in office or at home?
Adrian's probably the expert on this one, Eric. He's the one that lives in this data, but I think he has seen kind of some trends there on that. I think we just did one.
Yeah, I absolutely speak to that. So if it's a sales team, we do tend to see quite, let's say Monday. For most organizations, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we see the highest amount of productivity. But in sales teams, it actually tends to be on Mondays.
Huh.
So one day I would say definitely let people work remote would be Fridays. Overall, pretty much across all industries, all orgs, we tend to see the lowest amount of productivity there. So that's one easy win. I normally would say Monday, but since we're talking about sales reps, I'll probably lean closer to Wednesday,
Yeah.
potentially. You definitely don't want to do Monday for sales teams, but all other groups you can choose Monday and Friday.
Yeah, interesting. That's great. Well, I want to make sure that we have a chance to kind of keep moving forward here. So, why don't you kind of take us on a spin on the employee engagement piece, right? So now we've talked about how we maximize, how we try to turn some B players into A players, maybe not C players, and trying to really support that. Now we have to actually make sure that we retain them, right? And so talk a little bit, Mike, Adrian, what you all see in the data there about employee engagement and some early warning signs for burnout and turnover.
Yeah, I'll just kind of introduce the topic, right? Because it's a fascinating one, right? I think kind of the beauty of kind of how we get the data and collect the data for different clients is we kind of know when they leave the office suite, right? So we kind of know when they're not with the organization anymore, right? So obviously it would be a churn, right? In some fashion for that employee. So allowing us to have this data, Adrian's been studying it. I don't know, this project's been going on for about a year. He's been studying kind of like retention and those types of pieces, and how can we potentially predict it, right? Give you kind of like a radar on that type of thing, so you don't lose your top people. I don't think there's anywhere I can like recall losing my best salesperson at all the different companies that I've had over the last 20 years when they come in to resign. I mean, those are some of the worst days that you have as a sales leader, because you know how much effort that it is to replace them, and you just don't want to lose those. I think that's like every sales leader's worst nightmare is unexpected churn. So I'm excited for kind of Adrian to kind of share some data here.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I would say that's really interesting, we look at the behaviors of individuals that leave the org and those that stay within their organization, and we utilize machine learning methods to figure out which ones of these behaviors are most characteristic of those that are at risk of leaving the org, and we surface those people to our customers. And one thing that I've noticed quite consistently in the staffing industry is that you all get burnt out. Burnout is very common. It's extremely common within the industry, and how we go about operationalizing burnout is based on the amount of activity. Meaning, for those that we've seen specifically in this example for this customer, the individuals that had higher amount of activity and were working longer hours, specifically at night, were the individuals that were highest at risk. One role in particular, recruiters or any type of outwardly facing role, is one that you'll definitely want to look out for. But this is why I say management and having the right leaders in your organization that are actually having touch points with your people are crucial. Anything you want to add there, Mike?
No, it's just no, just the kind of the visibility, and I think it's like a delicate balance that like we know activity, like if we go back to those other slides, right? Like the more activity you put in, the better results you're gonna have, right? But there's a delicate balance to that, right? In having the data, you're really able to kind of sense the behaviors of a different salesperson, right? Like if Eric's my salesperson and I have like an understanding of his cadence that, this guy, he gets in at 6 a.m., he cranks till 3 p.m., he's active all day long, right? And he's had that same cadence for, the last 3 months, and he's hitting his numbers where, oh my gosh, now he's doing 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., right? Like that might be those type of alerts that, you look in as a leader now that you have kind of that visibility to kind of check in with him, right? Because you knew what his cadence was, right? You knew when he was successful in hitting his numbers, and now he's up 30% over the last 60 days. It's kind of that, red alert for that leader to go, okay, let me just have a conversation, a check-in, to make sure they're where they need to be. Also, in the other standpoint is like, let's say Eric was that, 6 a.m. to 3 p.m., cranked all day long, great performer. Let's say I see a 40% drop in that activity, and maybe I haven't seen it in his gross profit or his revenue numbers, that end indicator. It allows me to intervene earlier on to get him back on track, right? And then I can easily go in that next week and see, okay, Eric's back up 30%. Whew. And like I've had scenarios where it's like, oh my God, Eric dropped again. And I'm calling the CEO like, hey, Eric, you got to call Eric, you got to get him back in. I don't know what's going on there. But like not having that kind of visibility and that data is what kind of, is the unexpected churn of good players that just kind of it's the worst nightmare of a sales professional.
Great.
Got one more here, I think, Adrian.
Yeah, I'll go through this one really quickly. I added this slide because I wanted to give a little more context to this burnout concept. One thing that we do notice is for successful people that are in the A group, A players, for the most part, we do tend to see more general activity in the morning and a tapering off in the afternoon. But what's interesting here is that for those that are at risk, when we look at the actual peak of the distribution, dark blue being those that are not at risk, light blue being those that are at risk, we're seeing peaks in the morning and in the afternoon. And that's one indicator for you to look at as a sales leader, in particular, to see if people are getting burned out. Are we seeing a lot of activity in the morning, and then are we seeing it tapering off, or is that activity just high throughout the entire day? And those types of indicators are what we really study at our org.
Yeah, and I think this next, I think this is the final slide we have on kind of retention is pretty impactful because it really correlates with the earlier slides around manager collaboration. And this is a topic. I was just at the ISSA event in Oak Brook last week, and this was one of our topics that we were talking about is like how many direct reports can a leader handle? And I know you got some interesting data to share on that, Adrian.
Yeah, absolutely. So ideally, you would want leaders reaching out to their direct reports daily, but at minimum one time a week. And one thing that we noticed is I found this quite interesting because the relationship's quite discontinuous. It drops off a cliff after you see leaders with more than 6 direct reports. There's going to be at least one person on that team that they have not reached out to during that week. What we're noticing is that the more bureaucracy that an organization has and the more direct reports that a manager has, the higher the likelihood of churn being higher in that organization. So managers that have a lot of direct reports tend to have higher churn, and especially if there are higher levels of bureaucracy in the org, there's also going to be higher levels of churn. So kind of like a double whammy where the employee gets disconnected, I think, from the work that they're doing day to day, and that's what's really leading to this higher churn that we see.
Absolutely. And another thing which was an interesting piece of kind of the conversation, and I'm curious on your perspective on this, Eric, is, like they were talking about, and this was the discussion I had last week, they were talking about like having like team leads to help them with the direct reports, right? So they still have to, they still have to do sales, but then you put them in like a team lead role where they gotta help the other people, right? And then they were talking about like, okay, you moved them into a team lead role, now you lost all their production, and I'm curious your thoughts on that when you try to like, use other leaders to help you kind of manage from a direct report perspective, and any thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, you have to just expect that their individual productivity is going to drop off a little bit, right? Otherwise, they aren't doing what you just asked them to do. And I think the way you look at that, or the way you combat that from just a pure math standpoint, is like, if they're helping out 5 team members and each team member goes up by 15%, can we, weather a drop of 30% by your key performer? Probably. But if they go up by 5%, maybe not, right? And so you have to kind of recognize that piece. The other place that I do like that is that you're giving the opportunity for somebody to feel recognition, which we know is a key driver of engagement and avoiding churn. But they're also taking on additional responsibility, and they can feel like they're growing their career, even though they maybe, they're not getting a big compensation change, but they're getting some responsibility, and they're getting some things that they can talk about from a leadership standpoint if they, want to be a leader at the future. So I actually kind of like that. We see that people will do that on the surveys as well. They'll have, a lead recruiter in an office, that's maybe been there for a few years, ready for a new challenge, but not necessarily a true leadership role. They'll make them kind of the ambassador of the candidate experience. And they'll be the ones that are kind of, first in line to help understand what's happening around candidate experience, and reinforcing the importance of it within the office. So I do like adding some of those tasks, but you do have to be careful, because you are going to, you got to take from somewhere, right? Otherwise, that burnout slide is going to go way up. I've got a question for Adrian, and then actually we have another few in the audience here to kind of roll this out. And the question that I have is, help me kind of underscore this a little bit, because what I think that I'm seeing is that, look, the top sales performers are to some extent out hustling, and they're working more than others. And also, when we see people that are working longer hours, somewhat predictably, but the data really proves this, they are also more likely to burn out and to churn. So how, as a leader, should I kind of understand that balance? Like, first of all, am I interpreting that right? And second, I guess, what is the leadership imperative that comes out of that if I am?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it all comes down to how they're structuring their day. I think we're seeing the higher activity, even though they have not as long of days, and we're not seeing burnout as high in those that are A players compared to those that are C players. I think it really deals with how they're utilizing the tools in those morning hours. In my mind, the way in which you go about mitigating burnout is understanding that work does not happen at one level the entire time at all time.
Yeah.
There's an ebb and flow. People have to rest, people have to come into work, and that type of ebb and flow we should see throughout the day as well. So in my mind, when we're not seeing that from our employees, that's a warning sign. That's a red light going off that, hey, let's check in. Let's make sure that this employee is being efficient. Sometimes customers have found that employees just aren't using their time effectively. They're just focusing on the wrong tools. So in my mind, that's where the imperative is really to come in, check in with your employees, specifically when you see activity and productivity remaining at a high level all day.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think that variance from the norm matters a lot too, right? Because
100%.
just like in your health, like, people have different rates that they can go comfortably. I'm going to look very different after running a mile than Mike is, maybe, right? And the same happens at work, right? There's some people that, man, they're at their best when they're hopping and hopping and hopping. And there's other people that need a little bit more of that down, right? And so if you can kind of get that basic rhythm, it's really the variance from that rhythm that seems to be the thing that we should be paying the most attention to. Am I reading that right?
Absolutely. 100%. 100%. It's the variance from the norm that I think is one of the biggest indicators of whether, well, we use that for our retention model as well.
Yeah.
It's when we see that activity going significantly higher or significantly lower or just changing in its frequency. Those are signals that we use. So absolutely.
Yeah. So we have a couple questions, and then I want to kind of give everybody a chance to sort of wrap it up a little bit as well. So, Mike, this question is for you, from Karen Joe. She says, it seems that far more collaborative and positive for the employees to feel that they have a voice in their own performance. Can you talk about sharing this type of data with the employees themselves?
Yeah, I think that's where I kind of talked about earlier on, right? Like we've always managed with data from, kind of the top down, right? You get a report, KPIs, then you send it down to the manager then takes it to the employee, and it's always coming from that direction. And what we've seen, I was just on with a leader. He runs now, this definitely doesn't mean Adrian's kind of numbers, but he's running 19 recruiters, okay, himself, right? And what he loves about it is them having the data at their fingertips, right? And so he talked to me specifically about when he's going into like a one-on-one, the baseline is already set because they have the data. Okay. And so let's say in a scenario that someone's not meeting their quota, but maybe they're there and their activity levels are less than their peers. They actually have that data, Eric. So they can, week over week, I see that I dropped 30% in that, it was because I wasn't doing as many video, as many calls, as many of these different external activity components. The power of them being aware of that coming into the meeting with the sales leader. And that's what he was talking about, is that by them having the data and understanding where they stand versus their peers in their role, they have like a benchmark of reality with data, right? Not just like be more like Eric, you know what I mean? Like the top recruiter. They actually have like visibility into the data week over week, month over month of where they're at, benchmarking against their peers for like self-reflection and self-assessment. And he talked about how it specifically helps him in his one-on-ones where they come already knowing where they stand versus he was talking about before they have data on leading indicators, you'd start at end results, then you'd go into the CRM, you'd look at phone data, and you'd have to kind of work your way all the way backwards to go, you need more external activity. You know what I mean? And that process used to take 20, 30 minutes to get it down and isolate it to, we need more external activity versus the recruiter or the salesperson knowing where they stand at that point, from an activity side, and actually having visibility into the same data that their leader is looking at, which we know drives those A players to proper performance. So to ask that question, it gives them self-awareness. And that's a pretty powerful thing for sales leaders, because sometimes they think oh, it was that one deal I missed, because of X, Y, and Z, when in reality it was more than just that one deal you missed on why maybe you didn't get the proper end results that you were hoping for.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. We had another comment in there that that they use Power BI to give reps access to that similar data, and what they found is that their good reps, see that they are spending more time with like 3 out of their 20 targets, and then they balance it out, right? So they can kind of understand where they're spending their time, and I think that gets to my key takeaway, and then I'll ask for Adrian and Mike, just kind of one key takeaway that you each have as we kind of wrap this up. And my key takeaway is this, similar to the survey data that we do. Like the reality is that you are severely limiting the impact of what your team can do if you're giving them a generalized summary of what the overall team needs to work on, or what the overall team needs to focus on, because it is so individualized, and in professional services that is always going to be the case. Mike's strengths and weaknesses and natural rhythm is going to be different than Adrian's, which is going to be different than mine, and we need to give the data and manage those individuals as individuals. Otherwise, we're going to really limit the upside on that. Adrian, what's kind of your key takeaway that you would leave with the audience here as we close things out?
Yeah, I would say your good employees strive to be great. Ensure that you have the people and leadership in place to ensure that they can bring that greatness out of them. And self-awareness is huge, specifically at the employee level, even at the leader level. Even myself, I lose track of my team. I have a US and Sri Lanka-based team in which I manage. Seeing the data of who I've reached out to has always been triggers to help me understand, okay, who might I be potentially neglecting from one-on-ones? So just remember, your good employees strive to be great.
Yeah. Mike, close us
Yeah,
out.
I would just I know we talk so much on data and all these like minute points of the data, and those different stories there, is that you know, you got to make the data digestible. It's all out there. Like, we're not creating new data, right? Like, if you like the example on the Power BI, right? Like, the data is out there. It's feeding into a system, and you got to make it where it's digestible for them, right? Like, you cannot overwhelm the salesperson or the leader with the data to kind of distract from what they're trying to do, right? And so there is so much data out there, but you've got to get it all together and give it to them a way that they can easily digest it and take action upon.
Yeah, and that last part is the part I was waiting to see if you were going to say that, and you did, and it's so key, right? Is that you can, you know, digest it and take action on it, right?
Yeah.
Measurement for measurement's sake will not impact your business. Measurement leading to, you know, smart, intelligent, data-driven actions will. And so with that, I just want to take a second and just thank you, Adrian, Mike, for sharing the data, for sharing your insight, and some of the things that you all are seeing. Thank you to our audience for the engagement and good questions and the polls. Again, this will be available as a download. Also, the recording will be available here in a couple of days as well. But really appreciate the insight, Mike, Adrian, and thank you everybody for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.